believe in the ripple effect.
What's up? Another episode of Ripple Effect Podcast. I'm your host, Ricardo Rendes, also known as Ricky Fernandez, and amazing episode for you today. Sometimes there's guests that I'm super excited about having on, and I hope I can get the best conversation out of them because obviously conversations are a dance. It requires both of us to help each other out to make it look pretty and go smoothly. And sometimes it works and sometimes it doesn't work. Sometimes one of the dancers are off their game and we're stepping on toes. Well, this was not that case. This was the other case when you have an amazing conversation. Everything flowed. Everything was awesome. And let me just get right into who it is. It's Michael Millerman, who is an author, philosopher, thinker, host of the Millerman Talks podcast, and has a YouTube channel, professor at his own school called the Millerman School, and please check that out. And one of the most interesting people I've ever discovered, and it's thanks to actually a past guest and another one of the most interesting thinkers I've ever discovered, Michael from the Ancient Greece Revisited YouTube channel and also the On Tyranny podcast. And I can't thank that Michael enough to set us up and hook us up, because it was with his help that we got this interview scheduled and we hooked up. So thank you, Michael. I truly appreciate it because we had an amazing discussion and you guys are going to learn a lot. So get a pen and paper out and get ready for a roller coaster of a ride of perspectives and philosophies and philosophers and worldviews that you might have not ever explored before. With all that said, I'm going to try to get through this intro as fast as possible so we can get right to the conversation. But this is a value for value show. If you get some value out of this podcast, please consider giving some value back. Of course, financially, if you can't, no big deal. Rate, review, share, tell people about the show. But if you can financially support the show, a couple ways you can do it is we have a Patreon page if you want to donate monthly. We have a PayPal account if you want to do a one-time donation. We have a merch store if you want to support us by purchasing some merch, and we have hoodies, tank tops, t-shirts, v-necks, mugs, and much more. So please check out rippleeffectpodcast.com, click on support, and you can find all these ways of supporting the show. Or if you want to go directly to the merch store, you can go to the Ripple Effect Podcast merch.com, and that will bring you directly there. My guest today, Michael Millerman, has online classes and an online school, which you can try out for 30 days for free. So please check out the Millerman School. But I also am sponsored by my good friend Richard Grove and his University of Reason. So check out in the show description if you're interested in taking courses on philosophy, critical thinking. If you have some skills you want to expand on or some new skills that you want to discover, please check out the University of Reason. Those links are in the show description. And I have a new sponsor that I'm super excited about because it's a product that I love, and it's by one of my favorite health experts out there, Rob Wolf. Rob was on the Ripple Effect Podcast episode 381, and his recent appearance on JRE is episode 1784. And Rob's new company called Element, which is a electrolyte drink mix, has become a sponsor of the show, and that's Element, LMNT. It's awesome. I use electrolyte drink mixes all the time, especially Element, because it was formulated by Rob Wolf, who is somebody I've been following for a long time. I know that it's used with the best ingredients and it has the best stuff in it. And if you're fasting, if you're doing keto, a lot of times your energy level or headaches or fatigue or even recovery can be affected by your lack of electrolytes. And it's hard to get electrolytes without getting a bunch of sugar. And many of us do sugar-free diets or low sugar diets. And the cool thing with Element is there's no sugar and there's also no cheap sweeteners. It's sweetened with stevia leaf extract, which has very little to no effect on your blood sugar. will keep you in ketosis, will keep you in fasting. It's also useful to drink on a hot day. It's useful to drink when you're playing sports to stay hydrated. And most people don't realize when you're not eating, if you're fasting, if you're doing keto and you're not eating often, or you're avoiding fruit or sugary drinks, which will kick you out of ketosis or kick you out of fasting, you're also not getting moisture, you're not getting fluids. So electrolyte drink mix is a perfect alternative to all those super unhealthy sports drinks full of sugar. It's also a great alternative for kids. A lot of kids don't like to drink water. They want something with flavor. So this is a healthy alternative to those sugary drinks that typically we're giving to them. And if this product is something you're interested in, you can use the link below, or you can go directly to drinkelement.com/ripple effect. And that's the word drink and then lmnt.com/ripple effect. And from there, you can support the show and get some electrolytes in your diet. Thanks, everyone. Enjoyed this conversation, and I'll see you guys in the next one. Peace. What's up, Michael? Can you hear me?
I hear you just fine. Yeah. How are you doing?
Good, good. Thanks so much for being with me.
It's my pleasure. Thanks for the invitation.
No, it's my pleasure. This is one of those shows I was super excited about because I've been referencing your work and Dugan's work for such a while, and there's so many things I want to get into because you're such a fascinating guy and you're fascinated in so many other fascinating people. So it's this ripple effect of philosophers and thinkers, which I love. It's you find out about somebody that's really fascinating, and then you find out who inspired them, and then you go down those rabbit holes, and you find I love doing that. I love just being exposed to just different ways of looking at things and people who go against the grain and people who just kind of turn your worldview upside down, because I don't ever claim to know anything. I've just constantly just a curious explorer of information and knowledge and wisdom and whatnot. So Privyet, and I'd love to get to some of your background and some of your origin story for some of the listeners who might not be familiar with that, and then we can kind of go into I guess take turns into different topics from there.
Okay. Well, as I guess everybody knows, my name is Michael Millerman, and I studied political science at the University of Toronto for my PhD. So I have like an academic background. I was studying philosophy before then. And my PhD program ended up with me getting blacklisted from academia effectively because I had done work on Alexander Dugin. So the story of how I got to Dugin and why that affected my political science research, in short, it's like this. My initial interest was in mysticism before I ever thought about going to university. I was reading mystics from various religious traditions, and I was intrigued by the commonality of their accounts and by the different ways they interpreted. Like there seemed to be a similar underlying fundamental experience that they were interpreting in terms of the religious tradition they knew best. So once I discovered that, that was pretty intriguing and fascinating to me. But that was my world, mysticism. Then at some point, my older brother observed, that I wasn't in university and suggested that it would be a pretty good idea if I go. So I never dreamed of being an academic. It wasn't in the cards. Some kids, they're planning the school they're going to go to from a very young age, or their parents are planning that for them. I didn't have that, but I did start studying philosophy. And my first philosophy course was like, bam, this is for me. This resonated so much. It was an amazing, transformative experience in a way. So I'm super indebted. One of the guys I don't mention very often, like I talk about Dugin, other figures who are important to me, Strauss, Heidegger. But my first philosophy professor, he's crucially important to me because his approach to the study of these old books, his approach to the study of philosophy set him really head and shoulders above all of the other professors, all of the other teachers. So I took this interest in mysticism, combined it with this newfound love of philosophy, and that was like a piece of the puzzle right there. But because my family's from the former Soviet Union, and I grew up speaking some Russian in the household, I have kind of one foot in the West, one foot out of it. I was born in Canada, but the family, has this Russian side to it. So when I was studying the mystics, the Russian mystics came on the radar for me. And eventually these three things, mysticism, philosophy, and Russia, clicked When I read this article about Alexander Dugin that I read however long ago it was now, 2010, 2011, then I started translating his books, studying him, writing about him in the context of philosophy and political theory. And I just continued to do that for many years. But because he's a living, relevant, controversial figure, and a lot of academics like to play it safe with uncontroversial people who are no longer around, they like to lower the stakes. It became a bit of an issue that I was writing about him sympathetically or understandingly, making an effort to go beyond the headlines on him, so to speak, into the substantive issues of his work. So that got me pushed out of academia, and I eventually started my own school, millermanschool.com, where I can continue writing, teaching, researching, and just carrying on the work that I love the most, which is studying political philosophy, teaching it, discussing it with people who care about it, working with new students. And I'm really lucky that I was able to develop some sort of independent online academic presence, because if I got, torn away from that, that would be kind of heartbreaking, since it's what I love doing more than anything.
Yeah, that's there's so many things I want to dive into. One thing I kind of don't want to glaze over your intrigue with mystics, because hearing you explain it in interviews and on your show, it seems like, and I don't know if there's a link, but it seems like a couple other theories and people, past guests on my show, like Rupert Sheldrake, and his idea of like nature. He calls it like the science delusion in one of his TED Talks and in his book, in regards to how science thinks that nature has no purpose, has no consciousness, has no, it's nothing more than just matter. And I don't know if you're familiar with some of his work and some of his theories, but it's called morphin resonance, or what I forget what the name of his theory is, but it's this idea that we're all connected, that there's some type of conscious connection between all of us, and that if a mouse learns a maze in one location, then mice afterwards in other locations will learn the same maze quicker, because there's some type of connection. And I've also had Dr. Tom Cowan on, who is another really fascinating thinker, and he has this theory on water, that there's some type of intelligence or consciousness to it, because water connects everything. It's in everything. And so it's like a lot of times you hear these theories and you hear them alone, and you don't connect the dots, and then you're like, okay, well, this kind of makes sense, and this kind of backs up that idea, or it could be evidence of that. And then when I heard you talk about mystics, I'm like, well, this kind of also, it seems to be a little bit connected to this idea that maybe there's some common intelligence or consciousness all connected.
Yeah, so there's a sense in which, and maybe your previous guests have discussed this as well, a certain interpretation of the world, like let's say a very rationalistic, materialistic, reductivistic, or something like that, or even overly logical explanation of the world, it sets its boundaries at the outset. It says only whatever fits into this circle-shaped hole will enter into our experience. So, okay, fine, the circles will make it through the circle-shaped hole. Maybe some other shapes, you can force them through there. But the question is, what are you leaving out of the realm of experience because you've already put too narrow constrictions on what can show up for you in the first place? So when that happens, the people, like, either because for whatever reason they were raised with a different set of they have the square shaped hole and everything else like that, or because they had some personal experience. For some people it's through psychedelics, for other people, like through me, it's more through the study of books, concepts, and let's say a rich inner spiritual life, something like that. We begin to think that no, you've just constrained at the outset what can be experienceable without giving credit where it's due to the experiences that people have. So the fact that there is a tradition of mystics who write with some commonality, it's like what William James called a radical empiricism. They had some experience that they have something to say about. And if we a priori said, no, that can't be because there's no soul, there's no God, there's no self-transcendence, there's no consciousness, all that there is you're remembering your experience of being in the womb or something like that. If you let the interpretation get in the way of seeing in the first place, like one of the things that a tradition I care about, the phenomenological tradition, tried to do was say, let's take all of our explanatory theories that have the effect of distorting our interpretations and explanations, and try to correct for that distortion, try to get them out of the way so that we can just see unmediated, as clearly as we can, what it is that we're trying to talk about. Now, Heidegger did that in the history of philosophy. Husserl did that when he discussed the construction of mathematical consciousness in his account of Galileo and things. But you can do that with the mystics as well. If you interpose a theory between yourself and what they're saying, you might miss out on the whole picture. So from what I know about Rupert Sheldrake and from what I know about people in general who are sort of on the other side of the rationalistic reductivism, they all want that kind of thing. They all say, look, why don't we just look and see what's actually going on without, chopping off the branch that we're sitting on before we've had the chance to enjoy the view, so to speak. Yeah.
Well, something I find fascinating with scientists is that this idea that, well, one, it's become a dogma, right? I mean, it's one of those things where they don't realize that they feel like they're almost exempt to dogmas, and yet they've literally subscribed to one. But like I've heard Rupert Sheldrake say this and others say this about how scientists today feel like modern science has everything more or less explained, and then they just got to there's a couple things they just got to fill in, right, that they're still figuring out. And it's like that's probably the most unscientific thing you could say, and just about every scientist throughout history has probably felt similar and been wrong. And so this idea that we can ever be certain of anything is just so unscientific. So that's really fascinating. Yeah, the whole mystics thing's very, very fascinating, and I really recommend people to go deeper down that rabbit hole with some of your work and some of your thinking in that. Somebody else I wanted to dive deep into, because I'm so fascinated with him, and I can see why you were so fascinated with him, was Alexander Dugin, which Dugin and I don't have much in common besides we both have been banned off YouTube, so we do have one thing in common. But what's fascinating is how can a thinker, somebody who is doing nothing but proposing ideas, not proposing violence, but proposing ideas, why is he such a danger to society that he has to be banned? And so I guess we can go right into like, what was your fascination with him? And then maybe we can get into why you think he is being censored or his ideas are being banned.
Okay, we can do it in reverse order, I think, because it's easy to say to a certain extent why he's considered threatening by the people who censored him and sanctioned him. He's under legal sanctions in Canada, the United States, probably other countries as well. And his not only YouTube was taken down, which, by the way, as somebody who researches him, was a big blow because there were a lot of lectures there that had nothing to do with contemporary politics or with contemporary geopolitics that were really fascinating, but that are difficult to access now that his channel's been taken down. But the key thing is this: in 2014, when he was sanctioned, the first, you could say, round of recent hostilities between Russia and Ukraine, and now in the second most recent round of them, it was recognized that Dugin is a leading ideologue for the anti-Western position called Eurasianism that many people think helps to explain what Putin is doing when he makes radical breaks from the Western consensus and takes radical steps against the prevailing rules-based liberal world order. So Dugin helps to explain a lot of that, but not only does he help to explain it, he's an interested party, He champions Russia's break from that rules-based order, and he does so both as a theorist and at times as a player, agent, or activist. For example, he goes around meeting people and meeting parties and things like that, helping them on the ideological side of their self-understanding. So if you see Russia as a primary threat, especially in these periods, 2014, 2022, and if you see Dugin as playing an important ideological role for supporting the regime and kind of pouring fire on the gas of the conflict, then they say, okay, we don't want people to hear that. We don't want people to see it. It's a threat to our efforts to create whatever it is that the United States is trying to create in this conflict as they see it. And he gets yanked off. So that's basically, the rationale. Just like domestically, the powers that be, they pull people off platforms, perhaps like yourself and others as well, off various platforms who they see as a threat to the ideology of the regime domestically or internally. So they go after people like Dugin who are a threat to the logic of the regime externally or in foreign affairs. Now, that's justifiable to a certain extent. You know, in a war, you want to help your friends and harm your enemies. You want your country to win, the other country to lose. The United States is not formally at war with Russia, but still in its proxy, et cetera, et cetera. Like there's a justification for taking certain acts against figures like that. The problem, though, I think, and there are a few problems, but the main problem from my point of view is number one, if you want to understand Russia, you have to study its most important theorists, ideologues, and activists. Dugin is somebody like that. So by banning Dugin, we actually harm our own interests in understanding Russia. Secondly, if you want to have any kind of not just know your enemy understanding, but like possible build a strategic rapport, right? Be able to say something that's not going to have the unintended consequences because you don't know how it's going to be interpreted by the other side. So all of the possibilities of rapport that could be developed with understanding Russia's self-interpretation, they're off the table. So from that point of view, on a policy level, it's very bad. On a practical level, in my view, and a pragmatic level, it's very bad. But for me personally, my primary interest being political theory, political philosophy, and education, it deprives us, in my view, of an important source of insight into some fundamental questions of what it is to be human, what is the nature of the world order, what are the relevant alternatives in international relations theory that we are or aren't thinking about. Something that's close to me is I work on this German philosopher, Martin Heidegger, who had a huge influence in and out of the United States and North America, big influence in France, and every country, every field. Well, Dugin is a big Heideggerian. He's written several books about him. He's called Heidegger the deepest foundation of his fourth political theory. And Dugin's Heideggerianism teaches us some important things, in my view, about how we have been reading Heidegger, what we've been leaving out, you know, so it's like important to have him as part of the conversation. All of that becomes practically impossible. I'll give you a little example. Should I say this? Okay, I'm going to. Well, I translate Dugin. I've been doing it for a long time. Recently, I've been translating a book of his called Martin Heidegger, The Possibility of Russian Philosophy. And I had a plan to publish the translation, like part of it, to fund the publication of the rest of it and all of this. I've been working on it. It's really good. It's interesting. I've written about it before. And I have to pause now in a way I never really had to before and talk to sanctions lawyers to make sure that I'm not breaking any law by publishing a translation of this book, which is of some importance, in my view, for understanding not only Heidegger, but also Russia. And it's like, you know, the law has put itself in between the text and the reader in a way that's not unprecedented in the history of human life, but it's completely incompatible with how we normally think about the importance of free inquiry, research, scholarship. Like it's a bit of a problem, you know, that should be the case. So that's why he's considered dangerous. He's somebody who challenges, okay, there are a lot of people who challenge, they don't like liberalism, or they don't like the cathedral, or they don't like, you know, something else, to use Curtis Yarvin's term, the cathedral. They don't like some of the prevailing institutions, practices, or ideas, but they are relatively disharmonious and marginal when it comes to offering an alternative, like a consistent and plausible alternative that can be implemented at the state level, or at the regional level. Dugin is not like that. Dugin's got a model that can be implemented at the state or regional level. So he's considered a ideational risk to the liberal world order, and therefore they go after him.
Yeah.
I'll say, sorry, go ahead.
No, go ahead. No, go ahead.
No, just the second part of your question was how I became interested in him. So I like to put it this way, okay? There are some people who just Google Alexander Dugin and they'll read that he's a Satanist and you know, he wants to kill all the Ukrainians and he wants to blow up the United States. And they'll be like, okay, well, I don't really want to learn much more about this guy. Or on the other hand, maybe like they're eager to learn about him. That's not at all the way that I discovered him. I discovered him, you could say, top down, from the or bottom up, depending on what you see the top and the bottom. I discovered him as a political philosopher, as someone who's writing about Plato and Heidegger, as somebody who's addressing key issues in political theory, not primarily as a gutter activist, like some of my professors later came to characterize him. So because I was reading about mysticism, philosophy in Russia, I read this article on Dugin. Give credit where it's due. It's by a guy named Yigal Liverant. If you don't know the name, the title of the article will be better. It's Alexander Dugin, Prophet of a New Russian Empire. Great article, one of the better things written about Dugin. There's a lot of trash written about him too. So I read that, I got into it, really intrigued. And I went and found his lecture. The first one that came up for me at the time was a 5-minute talk he gave on the fourth political theory. So this was like, besides the article, the first thing I heard him say. The idea of the fourth political theory, I assume maybe you and your listeners already know it, but I'll give you the 30-second version, that the 20th century was characterized as a battle between ideologies, liberalism, communism, and fascism, and that you can basically understand the history of the 20th century in those terms. And what you see by the end of the Cold War is liberalism is the last ideology standing. Now that leaves us with a question. How can you oppose liberalism, or can you oppose liberalism, without being either a communist or a Nazi fascist? Is there an alternative, or do those three exhaust the options? What has changed with the victory of liberalism over its enemies? Because the field of the political is a field of combat. But when liberalism won, so to speak, when it was the last ideology standing in the unipolar moment, there's no more combat. There's no more combatant. There's a single superpower. So what does that mean for the constitution of the whole field of the political? Well, I heard him give that talk. It's about a 5-minute talk. And I thought, it's pretty good. This is interesting. This resonates with my experiences, with my thoughts, with my studies. People are being, even then, this was 2011, people were being called fascist who clearly were not fascist because they were criticizing liberalism without being communists. Therefore, they must be fascist according to that model. And yet I could see they're not fascist. So something's wrong with the model. Then Dugin comes with this fourth political theory, and it's like, that's why. They're thinking in terms of ABC, and they don't understand the alphabet has more than ABC. There's only so much you can say with ABC. You know, you can't even form a coherent sentence. So maybe we need to enrich our language of political theory and political philosophy. Then I looked him up on Wikipedia. I went to the Russian version, which is richer than the English, as you can imagine. And I saw that among his many publications, he had a book called The Fourth Political Theory. And since I just watched a lecture on that topic, I was still an undergraduate, so I proposed to my supervisor translating that book. And I did. And then my translation got put together with someone else who was working on it. It was published in July 2012. And that's it. I continued translating his works, and we had all kinds of drama, ups and downs and things like that. But that was the moment of discovery. It was these little pieces fell into place. Here's someone who's very thoughtful. You need to understand him to understand Russia. That was one of the key points of the article that I mentioned to you. He understands something about Plato, Heidegger, philosophy, and all of these things. He's super controversial. And then one of the things in the article that intrigued me, to be honest, was that there's this anecdote. It said that he was banned from Ukraine. Now, I didn't know much about the politics of the region at the time, to tell you the truth, but the article said Dugin had been kicked out of Ukraine. And as a result, or in response, like a tit for tat, the Russian government expelled the Ukrainian ambassador, or some high-ranking Ukrainian figure. And I thought, whoa, that's kind of interesting. Why should the Kremlin have the back of this weird, mystic, occult philosopher guy? Like, what's the relationship between all of that? So he struck me as a kind of philosopher king figure who embodies the Russian soul. It was just too much, it was just too intriguing to let go of. And I translated a bunch of his books, and as I say, I went through all kinds of ups and downs professionally as a result of it, but I still think he's important. I teach his books in my school. I have more things coming out about him, and everybody who ignored him in 2011 and 12 suddenly is writing articles about him in 2022 because they've realized that you need to understand Russia's anti-Western, anti-liberal ideology if you want to make sense of what they're doing.
Yeah, I'm a big fan of having people on, even if I don't agree with most of what they have to say, to just explore why they think the way they think, or any type of worldview or wisdom they might have captured throughout their life journey or experiences. I've had Jack Abramoff on the show. He's, people might know him from the documentary and film Casino Jack. He's a lobbyist. I've had Roger Stone on the show. I've had people on that I don't necessarily agree with, but they might give me some insight into something that uniquely only they can give me insight to. So this idea of banning somebody is fascinating. And I've heard you say this idea of like the West always embracing the other, like, okay, let's embrace the other. Let's understand the other, unless the other is a threat to them, like Alexander Dugin. And then all of a sudden you want to dismiss him or ban him. And, this idea that anybody, big tech or whoever, decides what truth is for you, because we're not. And again, this might be a psychological issue with the people in power or the elite, for lack of a better term, that historically they've always felt like they should be making the decisions for us because we're not intelligent enough to do so. I've heard you talk about the noble lie and all that type of idea of like, okay, we're lying, but it's for the greater good. It's for a just cause or moral reason. In regards to Dugin, something I've said, and I've gone down that rabbit hole, and I've diving into some of his interviews and thinking. It seems like trying to understand Ukraine, and I try to understand the Ukraine-Russian conflict as best as I can. Going back, watching the Oliver Stone documentaries, that he's done some great work on that kind of give you an insight of Putin's perspective on the whole scenario. But it seems like, and I'd love to get your perspective on, do you think because Dugin is a reflection or an influence on Russian perspectives and philosophies and worldviews, do you think that that's one of the reasons why the West sees them as a threat, that it's more than just geopolitical or more than just financial or resources, it's ideologies, right? Because he is Russia is one of they're one of the countries that seems to resist Western ideology and have the capability to resist it more than other nations. Do you think that that's a part of the puzzle?
Yeah, I do think that's part of the puzzle. Yeah, there are other considerations, like you said, economic, geopolitical, and all of that. But this ideological dimension, it's pretty important because the ideological component of the West's self-understanding, that the superiority of democracy to authoritarianism, or that's at a very elementary level. Okay, all of the ways that the West justifies itself as superior in terms of its ideas, even if it's the understanding of the role of politics over morality or power over ethics or something like that. However you configure it, there's a sense of privileged understanding of the meaning of history, privileged understanding of the meaning of human values, human life, okay? And whenever you have a legitimate contender, like what would a legitimate contender have to offer? At least an equally comprehensive system of understanding that is not identical, right? So it has to be comprehensive enough to address the differences in emphasis, right? Like, what's the relationship of history to truth? What's the relationship of technology to morality, right? What's the relationship at a very simple level sociologically between the sexes? What should the family be, right? What's constructed, what's natural? Those big picture questions, Dugin has developed a set of answers to them that are not compatible with the prevailing Western ones. And okay, he's not the first. There are other people and other traditions, like certain Islamic traditions, certain Chinese traditions, right? Certain other models of thought that are not compatible with Western liberalism. And you know them, I know them. People reach out, I'm sure, to you and to me, and we reach out to them at times to try to understand that. But what Dugin thinks makes his model unique compared to those is this, for example. Take Islamic anti-Westernism or Islamic anti-liberalism. You have to be Islamic to a certain extent to enter into that world. It depends on the premises, to a certain extent, of the religion and of its adherents. It reflects the faith of its adherents. By contrast, in a way, Dugin's model, the fourth political theory, is not only for Russians, not only for Christians, not only for the Orthodox, and therefore he's had the ability to enter into dialogues with other anti-liberals, anti-Western figures, anti-modernists, and things like that in other parts of the globe. He's been able to build a kind of ideological consensus among his geopolitical supporters because of the openness or flexibility of his model. So I wonder at times, who offers today, in a systematic, comprehensive way, an alternative to all of the variations of Western liberal thought that we're used to and that prevail today? Dugin definitely is one of the people offering something like that, So I'll give you a sense of it. A lot of people, when I started writing about him in 2011 or 12, they saw him primarily as a geopolitical thinker. And those of your listeners who are looking him up for the first time or for the second time may see that he's got this book, Foundations of Geopolitics, that was pretty influential and that was kind of infamous in its own way and still is in its own way. So he was treated as a geopolitical thinker. But in fact, he writes about geopolitics, ethnosociology, books that I translated, theology, philosophy. And he says in his books on the fourth political theory that the goal of his model is a complete reconfiguration of the sciences, of what we esteem and don't esteem, what we value and don't value, what we honor and dishonor. So it's a completely different regime of thought. It's not just one little changed thing here or one little changed thing there. He's what my old dissertation supervisor, one of the guys I don't like, who resigned from my committee and did all kinds of other horrible things, he calls an epic theorist. You know, Dugin's an epic theorist. He's got a model of time, history, meaning, man, his place in the world, relationship to God, and all of that. So it's important, it's valuable, it's interesting, and it's instructive for us when we study it. One of the things that maybe I have not made clear enough, although I've gone out of my way a million times in all my interviews, all my courses, and everything I've done to make this clear, but I'll say it once more, is that we study Dugin not primarily in order to become Duginists. It's like you said, when you listen to something that you would not have heard otherwise, it gives you more scope for understanding. You see more, you can think more, you can triangulate, you can do all of these things that you couldn't do before when you just put a new figure on the table and consider what he has to say. So there are parts of Dugin's thought that I'm sympathetic to, other parts that I think he gets wrong. You know, there are things where I think he's helpful, things where I think he's less helpful, but not considering him or reading him only to become a slavish adherent to his ideology, those are two extremes that we have to avoid, not just in the case of Dugin, but in the case of anybody we study seriously. You know, like I'm teaching Nietzsche's Zarathustra at the moment in my school, and at the end of the first part, Zarathustra, he tells his followers, you know, okay, fine, you've all become really inspired by what I've had to say to you. You're all eager to follow me. You're leaving behind the marketplace and, you know, you're intrigued by this idea of the overman. But don't just put all your belief in me. You have to go work these problems out for yourselves. You got to figure this out for yourself to a certain extent. So that's true of any kind of discipleship or any kind of faith in a teacher. And I just know there's that risk because there are people who read Dugin as slavish acolytes to his ideology. And there are people who don't read Dugin out of a slavish adherence to some other ideology. We don't want slaves in our education. We want free thinking individuals with human dignity. So both of those forms of slavery, I think, should be identified, repudiated, and, you know, let's go like thoughtful human beings through the alternatives and try to get a sound and sensible perspective on things.
Yeah, to quote James Corbett, who's a friend of mine, been on the show a bunch. He said this a long time ago. We were talking about parenting and schooling and that type of thing, and he's like, school is supposed to be a place that teaches you how to think, not what to think. And now basically they've been a brainwashing factory of just pushing ideologies on the kids and really not. It's scary because I have two little ones, and it's just you try to unschool them, right? You know, and maybe we should be homeschooling permanently. We did during the lockdowns and whatnot, but it gets hard with, you know, work and all that stuff.
Of course.
But there's always this danger of teachers pushing their ideologies onto the kids. And
yeah, let me say, if I could just interject here for a minute, because this question, this division between how to think and what to think, it's also worth thinking about, you know, because you can't leave students with no substantive teaching as part of their early education. One of the things Aristotle said, and Plato shares this view as well, is in fact a key part of childhood education is giving them the right habits, because they don't have the rational faculties until later. But if you give them the right habits, once they have the rational faculty, they'll see there was a harmony between the early habituation and what accords with reason. So it's tricky, you know, just giving people methods of thinking without giving them something to think about, or certainly without inculcating some sort of basic foundations, substantive foundations, that also I'm not sure is so workable. And then another thing I want to add is when we talk about how to think, it's kind of like, okay, your method, you know, what's like, how are we going to think? Okay, we're going to weigh this, we're going to weigh that. The method is also its own kind of substance. The how is also its own kind of what. So I agree with you in the spirit of it, right? You don't want to ideologically indoctrinate the children. You want to teach them the ability to ask for evidence and weigh out the argument. Does this follow from that? And at the same time, there are problems with keeping those things so rigidly separate. You know, it's probably some combination of a well-tested, time-honored substantive teaching that gives people maximum amount of wherewithal later in life, together with, age-appropriate tools for reasoning. But just that radical separation, it's got its own difficulties. And then one other thing is that so if we say we don't want our kids to be ideologically indoctrinated, that's true. We don't want our kids to be ideologically indoctrinated. But if we continue that sentence, right, if we play it out a little bit more, typically we mean like we don't want our kids to be ideologically indoctrinated by leftist progressivists who are teaching them that there's no gender, no right and wrong, no morality, or that everybody who's X and Y is evil and everybody who's Z is good. Like there's a certain kind of indoctrination that we don't want. But if we said, well, okay, would you like your children to acquire the following principles that are different from these? I say, yeah, I won't call that ideological indoctrination though. I'll call that the formation of character or something like that, So we do, speaking for myself and my family, we do want our kids, when we think about education, to be instilled with some sort of pole star or compass, which is more than just method. And we want them to know how to think and how to reason and prepare them when they can do that individually, independently later on in life.
Yeah, that's really important. That just understanding. Well, I think a lot of us, we even with our own ideas and logic and reasoning, we contradict our own beliefs sometimes, right? You see it with my body, my choice with abortion, and then, but yet you can force vaccinate everybody and that's okay. And so same thing with like, I don't want you pushing your ideologies or any ideologies on my kid, but if they're pushing a ideology you subscribe to, then you're okay with it. So it is, that is the issue. I don't subscribe to many, or really, I wouldn't say any ideologies, because I struggle to plant my flag anywhere because I feel like it will stump my growth, or at least it'll have a influence on my ability to explore other ideologies and other worldviews and other. So it's like, in the past I've had guests say, it's like, well, you can admit that that's ridiculous and you should plant your flag here. And it's like, no, I don't want to plant my flag anywhere. I'm like, I kind of want to be open to new ideas. I can say I'm temporarily here and this is where I stand based on my information and wisdom or whatever you want to call it. But in time, I'm open to moving in one direction or another as I explore new and different ideas. So even with my kids, I love hearing stories like Robert Kennedy Jr. and he talks about how at the dinner table, his dad used to just debate, spark debates with the whole family and wanted everybody to be like, okay, why do you believe that? What do you, if you think I'm wrong, explain to me why you think I'm wrong. And they go down these rabbit holes. And I think families should do more of that. And obviously families aren't even really families anymore. Everybody's kind of roommates. They live together, but they don't really live together, which is another issue. In regards to the way that the world seems to be going, do you think that there's some resistance, there's some awakening because of how drastically things are just becoming or how it seems like the world's going crazy? Like I was joking around on a podcast yesterday that if we live in a simulation, I think a toddler has the computer and is just hitting every button because I'm like, so much of the world doesn't make sense. Is there a light at the end of the tunnel? Do you see a resistance? Because and I don't want to play politics in regards to like, oh, liberals. It's like, obviously conservatives have their own issues also. And I want to eventually also hit on Leo Strauss and hit some of his ideas, and also why people like Bill Kristol and Peter Thiel are fans of his and whatnot. But is there a light at the end of the tunnel? Do you think because there's a extreme left that eventually all it does is highlight how crazy some of these worldviews are, and maybe it will self-regulate in time?
There may be. It can go so far, and it's gone so far that some people see they don't want to be a part of it and they throw their weight, and some of them have a lot of weight to throw. in support of moderating balance by going to the right. Musk recently announced, as I'm sure you saw, right, that he's not voting Democrat. So he's someone with some weight to throw around, some money and some power and influence to throw around. And when he makes a decision, some people will have to, follow it or think about it. That kind of thing could swing the pendulum or could balance out some imbalances, but the pendulum continues to swing and things are never really in balance. Not in a republic like the American Republic, and not in politics more generally. They just aren't. What happens is these kinds of fluctuations and changes. So if you say, look, let's take a very nuanced, a very zoom in on a particular issue, right? Say students being taught sexual identity ideology when they are in second grade. Is there going to be a blowback against something like that? I hope so, probably. It seems like completely inappropriate, not very helpful, and sowing the seeds for all kinds of problems later on. A return from insane policies in some area to some kind of moderation or to the opposite extreme, yeah, that's always going to happen. There are a lot of ways in which I hope, let's say the right or the center right, wins some cultural battles. If Musk takes over Twitter, that's going to help, and things like that. But I like to take a step back to what I consider a more foundational level, without in any way denigrating from the importance of these local battles and policy wins and losses. All of that's important, and I leave it to the professionals who are in there campaigning and trying to make sure that they take power. Behind all of that, to a certain extent, are these deeper, more fundamental questions. You could call them abstract or philosophical questions. They don't concern the day-to-day politics quite as much. About, can we ever return to a certain understanding of human nature that seems to have been abandoned? That's not a policy victory that's going to happen in the next week or two or month or two. We're here talking at the level of philosophical tectonic plates that shift every 50, 100, 200, maybe 500 years. So I do wonder, are we on a track at that level where the train has left the station? There's no return to a notion of human nature. There's only different versions of transhumanism, posthumanism, of the influence on human nature, the technological mastery of human nature, that kind of thing. Or is there going to be a revival, and could there be one that's philosophically justified, of the idea of a human nature? Those are the kinds of questions that concern Strauss. They're the kinds of questions that concerned Heidegger and Dugin. And they're the ones that I think deserve at least part of our attention, as important as all of the pressing day-to-day policy issues are, crime and all of that. So I give, again, all credit to people who are working in that arena. There are a million things to do, and there are competent people, especially coming up now, who are dealing with them. But my focus is really on that set of philosophical questions. Like Heidegger, for example, he argued that even a revival of religious thought is not a response to nihilism, because contemporary religious thought is still nihilistic at its foundations. Arguments like that, where you say, okay, the right is going to start being more culturally active. Okay, but what do they understand by culture, and what do they understand by cultural activity? Is it just a facade, or is it rooted in something more fundamental? Those are the kind, as I say, those are the kinds of questions that these authors I work on, Dugin, Heidegger, Strauss being the top three, help us to think through. And then something else, like I taught Aristotle's Politics not too long ago. That was written a long time ago, okay? Before Jesus. So you read Aristotle's Politics and you see, wow, so much of what he said resonates in 2022 like it was written yesterday or this morning. Beautiful part of the Politics, he says, some people say cities shouldn't have walls. Think about the build the wall thing under Trump, right? Build the wall. No, we can't have walls. Aristotle mentions it. He says some people say we shouldn't have walls. In my view, you should have them and they should be beautiful. So Aristotle's like, make sure you build a big, beautiful wall. Could have been Donald Trump writing. And you're like, okay, that resonates. Other kinds of things as well. So a key question is, what are the unchanging constants of political life, where it doesn't matter how the pendulum swings? They're not changing. And what are those parts of political life over which we have some legitimate control? And what's the extent of control that we have in those areas? Those are some fundamental questions. Strauss and those guys, they draw our attention to the permanent, constant nature of political life. so that we don't make the mistake of thinking something that's going on now is just unprecedented, whereas in fact it has thousands of years of precedent that we therefore are obligated to understand if we want to be practically wise with regard to it.
Yeah, well, one thing you find reading old writings, old quotes, they all still make sense today, which enforces, what you're saying in regards to human nature doesn't change that much. I forget who said it. If history doesn't repeat, it at least rhymes. It's true. Like you can read something and it makes just as much sense today, or you can relate it to the world today, almost regardless of what year you're talking about or living through, because maybe our environment, our external reality might change slightly, but our internal reality might be the same, or at least very similar. And so that's very fascinating. Yeah, Leo Strauss is another guy, thanks to your work, that I've really dove deep into. And I know when I was actually researching him, I ran into this Peter Thiel interview with the Hoover Institute, I believe, where he talked about Leo Strauss and his opinion on the Enlightenment, and how he thinks that, post Enlightenment, they believe that if you remove these debates and these arguments about religion or these bigger questions, then we would have a better world, because it would stop some of the wars and conflicts. But instead, it kind of moved us towards this materialistic approach of worldview that leads us to this kind of mindless, less fulfilling lifestyles that we live today. And I was born in Portugal, and I still talk to family in Europe, and we, growing up, we used to go there every year. And there's something fascinating about their lifestyle that I feel like Americans have it all wrong. It's you come to America with this idea that, like, you're going to get more ones and zeros, and that's going to pave the path to happiness. And what happens is that, like, I feel like we're all unfulfilled, unhappy, and there's this internal pain. And then these material things is the painkiller. It's the Advil, it's the ibuprofen, and you keep taking it. It makes the pain go away for a little bit. But if you stop taking in this material stuff that gives you this temporary satisfaction, then you realize, like, there's some underlying pain that is consistent and is not resolved. And so that Enlightenment kind of perspective was interesting, because it's like, okay, you kind of looked at the Enlightenment like it, in many cases, people look at it, the average person, as it's a good thing, but it could be a cause to a lot of the issues we're dealing with today.
Absolutely. So in my view, Strauss is indispensable here. He's not the only person who writes about the costs that came with the Enlightenment, but he's the most profound, he's the most serious, and he's the one, if you have to pick one, in my opinion. Because he shows how, in the history of political philosophy, Enlightenment political philosophy arises as a modification of the old teaching. So we never really understand Enlightenment political philosophy if we don't understand what it modified and why it modified it. That's one of the things that he helps us to see very clearly. Once we have that big picture, once we see in the history of political philosophy what the inventors of modernity or the enlighteners were trying to accomplish and why, then we can judge, was it worth the cost, and are we just seeing the consequences of the principles play out? One of the things that Strauss wrote when writing about John Locke and commercial republicanism, American style, was that it ends up being the joyless quest for joy, which I think captures to a certain extent what you were saying, right? Everybody's rushing, seeking the next thing, got to get this, got to get that. And what it is that they're seeking for is a kind of joy or happiness, but it never culminates in joy or happiness. And the process itself is joyless. And that's why you need all of these sedatives or whatever else it happens to be. What's the opposite? Not the sedative, but the one that excites you or whatever, right? It's joyless quest for joy. You end up having these recourse to all of these substitutes. Well, in his explanation, to a certain extent, what lies at the foundation of that model is a certain set of teachings about what is man, what is desire, what is happiness. Should happiness be, is it possible for everybody to be happy, truly happy? Or is happiness associated with a kind of life that in principle cannot be universalized? Like, there are all kinds of fundamental disputes. I can't recommend highly enough If people don't go to my school, that's fine. If they don't read Dugin, that's fine. If you're going to read one of the people that I talk about or mention, in my view, the most helpful of all of them is Strauss. He lays bare the foundations of all of these disputes in a way that nobody else does. It's truly amazing. But then it's like, okay, look, we gain a lot with the Enlightenment. We need to know what we gain, but we gain some things in that trade-off. We gain a certain kind of freedom. We gain a certain kind of individuality. We gain some room for maneuver that we didn't have before. But yeah, it comes at like one of the major costs, one of the major risks is the idea that technology, is there a saying technology is going to eat the world or something like that? Well, here technology eats and devours the human world. It remakes the human being. It becomes like a nihilistic snake eating its own tail. And once we understand those possible consequences, then it's like, okay, maybe we made a misstep along the way, took a wrong turn at some point. Strauss calls the Enlightenment in his Machiavelli book, maybe we should call it, he says, the great obfuscation. It limited our horizons. It lowered our sights. It narrowed our vision. It brought some things into relief that way, but it also left a lot, it made us blind to a lot that used to orient a meaningful and a happy human life, not just individually, but socially and politically. Okay, well, that's a problem, right? Have we made ourselves blind to something that we need to see in order to live well? That would be a problem. So Strauss's whole task of recovering the ancient political philosophy, it's like, some people today talk about the need for ancient wisdom in relationship to like modern science. Well, for Strauss, it's the ancient wisdom of political philosophy as a correction to the ills of modern political science, as a kind of parallel. So if anybody out there is the ancient wisdom type but doesn't study political philosophy, Strauss gives us the ancient political wisdom. And he sets up, again, he doesn't say older was better, modern is worse, but he lets us see it. Then when we see it, we can think about it ourselves. Was the trade-off a good one or a bad one? The problem is that we don't see it most of the time. That's what he's so helpful in doing. But Thiel has an essay called The Straussian Moment, well worth reading for more than just Strauss. He mentions there Schmidt as well and René Girard, and he raises the question of the meaning of Christianity for our times. So Thiel is a serious guy, needless to say, and understanding his attitude towards Strauss is important for sure. Seeing, Thiel took a step beyond Strauss. He said Strauss is not, we can't stop there. Even though the essay is called The Straussian Moment, it ends on Girard. And, Thiel and his acolytes, some of them Thielists, others not, they put Girard back on the table. It gives us another way of thinking about social life and political life. But I counsel not being so fast and moving beyond Strauss.
Yeah, that's interesting. And in regards to like Bill Kristol and the neocons and this link, because if some people go and search Leo Strauss, they're going to find some conversations about neocons and people that maybe they don't like as much. What is the link there? And what would you say to people who might dismiss Strauss once they hear that some people who, borderline, maybe even more criminals, are fans of his?
Okay, I'll say a few things about it. The first one, as a general principle, don't not read an author because of some association argument. I think that's true for Dugin, it's true for Strauss, it's true for a lot of people, for Heidegger, okay? You're never gonna see what you could see by just reading the book if you put between you the guilt by association argument. So that's the first thing. I just think it's not a good idea. But it is true that some people who are neocons, and incidentally, this is what attracted me to neoconservatism back in those days, 2011, 2012, that some neoconservatives thought of Strauss really highly. Some of them were his students, many of them were his readers and admirers, including Bill Kristol. Now, the fact that Kristol takes the political positions he does now and did then, it's not a function of what Strauss taught about the nature of political life. Everybody interacts with a book. You read what the author said, you understand what you can understand, what you liked, didn't like what you didn't like, and you have your politics. And they sometimes intermesh, but it's never a one-to-one correspondence. Okay, unless in the case of the craziest fanatic, then maybe it's a one-to-one correspondence. So Kristol learned from Leo Strauss that there's a classical wisdom that the modern teaching is distorting, that there's something to recover, something valuable. And he's right about that. And on that point, I'm 100% with him. You can see he has a YouTube show, I think it's called Conversations with Bill Kristol, and he's had some Straussians on, like this guy named Harvey Mansfield, for example, who writes about Machiavelli. He's translated various books. He was a student of Strauss's, and he's a smart guy. So you can watch Bill Kristol talking to Harvey Mansfield, learn something about Machiavelli, and it's got nothing to do with going to war in Iraq. You know what I'm saying? So you have to decouple, in my view, to a certain extent, those things, and just think them through. But it is true, some neoconservatives read Strauss, but so did many people today in particular who are not neoconservatives, who don't like neoconservatism, who are anti-neoconservative, who are on the opposite side of the spectrum to Bill Kristol. You know, there are schools of Straussians, and there are schools like anywhere along the political spectrum, right? You can have, let's say, okay, I saw this quadrant on Twitter not long ago, which was mapping, you know, are you pro-Russia, pro-Ukraine, pro-Israel, pro-Palestine? Okay, so there's like pro-Russia, pro-Palestine, pro-Russia, pro-Israel, etc. Imagine you have, these are types, okay? We won't get into the details about the conflicts, but imagine you put Strauss in the middle, right? If this quadrant read him, there will be that form of Straussianism, or this form, or that form, or that form, right? People combine what they read with what they care about. But everybody, I think, who learned from Strauss, who admired him as a teacher, learned from him how to read old books carefully. This is crucial. This is something that sounds trivial, but is in fact super far from being trivial. It's really vital. Strauss showed that most of the people who read Plato, Aristotle, Machiavelli, Hobbes, Nietzsche, they did so too carelessly. They ignored too many relevant details. They imposed too much modern ideology onto the text and then saw it reflected back to them. And in his many books where he wrote about these authors, he taught, and in his classes, of course, he taught a generation of students to let these books come alive for them. What happens next, that's out of his hands. But allowing the books to come alive, that was in his hands, and he delivered the goods. And everybody, I think, who has learned to love him, as I have, is grateful to him for that. You know, that's his biggest gift, in a way, opening that door for us. So yeah, Kristol, okay, other people read Strauss. Michael Millerman, who's not currently either a Bill Kristol supporter or a neocon in that sense, you know, I read Strauss, love him, and I don't enter into that. In fact, a lot of quote unquote neocons, they hated the fact that I work on Dugin. So there's like, you see what I'm saying? It's not reducible, unfortunately. But in the popular, I'll say this. There was a time where there were popular articles, like journalistic trash kind of stuff, if I can put it that way, that said, Bill Kristol, George Bush, and these other people, they learned from Leo Strauss that people are very stupid and that you must lie to them. That's what they learned when they studied Plato's Republic together with Leo Strauss. And therefore, they invented the lie of weapons of mass destruction in order to go bomb Iraq and get, you know, a bunch of oil. And we anti-Straussians, we think no blood for oil. And it all gets collapsed into this view. Pro-Straussian means pro-Bush war in Iraq. Anti-Straussian means no blood for oil, pro-Iraqi or something like that, you know. That is a extremely, you can't learn anything, in my view, you can't learn anything important about Strauss or from Strauss if you start with that model. So you should just like acknowledge that model, put it to the side, but it's a separate question. You know, the neoconservatives and their lies on one hand, and Leo Strauss and his books on the other hand. They should be disambiguated.
And I agree with everything you just said, but I wanted to at least highlight it because I know somebody's going to be listening, going down that rabbit hole, and will be asking the same question, like, oh, how can I, why would I want to explore this guy's ideas if this person's a fan of him and this person's a fan of them? But like you said, Alexander Dugin, perfect example of similar type of thing. For me, I've always been attracted to the forbidden fruit. So anybody who, and I think many of us are. So anytime somebody says their ideas are dangerous, I want to immediately kind of dive into it and see what's so dangerous about their ideas.
So I just want to say two things about that quickly. The first is that if people search Strauss right now, they will find not only the neocon, like Bush Iraq war thing. There recently was an article, I didn't read it because I couldn't stomach it, but I'm going to have to eventually, about Straussians in Ukraine. You know that like Victoria Nuland is a Straussian, so Russia's war is justified because it's a war against Straussians. I have very low tolerance threshold for stuff like that, even though in general I have a high tolerance threshold, but they may see an article along those lines. But again, everything we said just now about the Iraq war and so on, it applies. About the forbidden fruit, I just had this image come to mind. This is from a medieval Jewish thinker named Maimonides, and it's helpful, I think. So a forbidden fruit, it's good to a certain extent. It's appealing because it's forbidden, but the fruit itself may be like a golden apple laced in silver. Okay, this is an image that this guy uses in one of his books. So we want to make sure that we see not just the silver lining or the silver filigree or whatever, okay, of the forbidden fruit. The forbidden fruit, it entices us by being forbidden, but it also has an inner and outer level. You know what I mean? Like someone might be attracted to Dugan because he's forbidden, but never get beyond the silver to the golden apple. You see? And I've noticed that, like people like dissident right thinkers or anti-traditionalists or whatever, who have an appeal to Evola or to Dugan or wherever they end up going because it's forbidden, because it has that character. And they, in some cases, stop before going to the heart of the matter. You know, there's like a layer deeper than the one where they go to. And that layer, the golden apple, so to speak, or the teaching of genuine insight, understanding, and wisdom, we should always have in mind that we aim there, I think. And I wanted to put in one more nice word for what you said earlier about talking to everybody. You know, this very nice and applicable principle that a wise man learns from everybody. You can only learn from everybody when you meet people, listen to them, talk to them, and think about it.
Yeah, I mean, we understand that everything's perspective. So somebody with a different life view, inspired by different books, different thinkers, different music, different movies, whatever you know they're being exposed to, which everything becomes a influence on their worldview. They're going to have a different perspective than I am, and I want to explore that because my perspective is going to be limited based on my experiences. So it's you know, and plus, anytime somebody believes in something, I'm intrigued with why, because you know, it's like what was it, Nietzsche who said that the dancing man seems crazy to the person who's doesn't hear the music. It's like I want to hear your music, like you're dancing to this, and I want to know what are you listening to? You know, what is it that maybe I'm not understanding? So to me, it's you know, it's really when somebody disagrees with, or when there is somebody who I disagree with or has different ideas, like I want to I'm attracted to it. I want to explore that. And I think we can take something from that. I mean, it'd be nice if we all lived that way. It's funny because I just, my last episode, no, like it's 1 or 2 episodes ago, I had this guy, his name's Four Arrows. He's actually a Native American, Dr. John Jacobs. And we actually disagreed a little bit, but I was curious on his worldview. He has a book called The Kinship Worldview. And it's kind of it's almost like anti being a philosopher in regards to the way you live your life and asking these bigger questions. He thinks that it has affected our ability to connect with nature and being one with it, you know. And it's like it was weird because it kind of, but initially I'm like, okay, wait, I disagree with that. But then I'm like, okay, I need to dive deep into this and I want to know, like, okay, what's his justification for this and all that stuff. So I think we get a lot of that. And I think the increase of popularity with like spirituality and maybe even psychedelics, anything that can get us out of because we are creatures of habit. And I think that a lot of times we get stuck in this routine. And we think as a routine, like it's more of a physical thing. But I think what happens is that it becomes very mental too and intellectual, like where we do the same thing every day. So we end up thinking the same way and seeing things the same way. And when we get out of our comfort zone, you know, either you travel or try something new or explore a thinker that you've never been exposed to, or listen to a podcast that is giving you a perspective you've never explored. All of a sudden it opens up your boundaries, you know, and I think that's really important because I think many of us are stuck in this, you know, we're this mouse on a wheel kind of running in place, and we need to be exposed to new things and just do new things because if not, we will restrict our thinking.
Absolutely. And I want to add that whether there is a common set of universal human concerns will arise in a way out of the study of many different perspectives. In other words, if you talk to 100 people and 1,000 people and 100,000 people or however many, right? You expand your set of perspectives and the different stories and everything, there may be a common set of concerns. where suddenly we find what looks like it could be the shared, if not nature, at least set of interests, concerns, and questions, right? So one of the things that Strauss taught me that I'd like to convey in case it's valuable is he said, when you look over the history of political philosophy, what seem like incompatible teachings, and they are at some level, are at a more fundamental level, all addressing a certain shared set of questions. So whether they lived in Middle Ages Islamic civilization or culture, whether they live in America in 2022, or whether they lived in Athens before Christ, all of these thinkers were wondering, how should I live? What's the nature of pleasure and justice? What is right and wrong? Are my good deeds rewarded or not? Am I good only because of the reputational benefits, or is behaving well actually healthy for my soul or for myself? Is there a God or isn't there? Is the world eternal or created, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera? Somehow there's a set of fundamental concerns. And even if there's no shared consensus about the answers, people differ as to their answers. And that's how you get sects and groups and schools. But if we can at least, I think Strauss was arguing in part, find that there's a consensus as to the importance of the fundamental questions, that has a kind of moderating effect on us. That kind of has a humanizing effect on us. And that, in a way, broadens our relationship to others in space and time. I think he's right about that. Not that, we can also formulate questions maybe that have never been asked before, but that there's this bedrock of fundamental human concerns that people ask about, I think is worth considering.
Well, I think those bigger questions are important. I was raised a Catholic, kind of resisted it, started playing heavy metal and skateboarding and BMXing, and did everything anti-Portuguese, anti-Catholic, just to kind of, I don't know, I'm just be a kid who rebelled. And it's, even though I still love those things, I end up leaving a team thinking I went to these free thinkers called atheists. And then I realized, like, oh wait, I just left a team and then joined another team who equally are sure that they hold truth with a capital T, so it was unusual. But as time went by and as I got older and having friends, I have friends that are Muslim, friends from Eastern Europe, all over the place, and a lot of them are religious and or spiritual to some sense, and I started kind of appreciating the fact that it gave them, especially with the West being so materialistic, that even if you don't agree with whatever religion it may be, organized religion it may be, at least it was helpful to some. I could see some help in regards of forcing people to kind of ask those bigger questions, where, like, if I didn't go to church on Sunday, I could just work all day, and in many cases in America you work weekends and you're checking your emails 24/7, and I never pump the brakes and take a moment to kind of be in the present or ask those questions about where am I going, what am I doing, am I really happy, and but yet if you're religious and you go to a church, and one, I think there's benefits in community and all that stuff, and that's really one of the things that really leads to true happiness. But the other thing is, at church, most religions, if not just about all the major ones, ask those bigger questions, like, is it more important to be moral? Is it more important to to think about the afterlife and where we're going, and all these bigger questions, I think, will make us a better person, because you don't get caught up in only the selfishness of only caring about yourself and how to get ahead and all that stuff. So and I know when you were on Undone Registered podcasts, Thaddeus Russell and many people who I think don't consider themselves religious or spiritual, especially the last couple of years, have felt like we're in some type of spiritual battle. And even myself, I feel like we're in some type of spiritual battle, even though I can't even really define that. And which is okay, because one thing I've learned from talking to our mutual friend, the other Michael from Ancient Greece Revisited, I love the fact that it's, he's completely content with not being able to define things and leaving things with a question mark. But I do feel like we're in some type of spiritual battle, and I can connect and understand why religious people feel like, the removal of these questions and this spiritual worldview is a threat to all of humanity.
I think you put it wonderfully. I mean, those religious practices, institutions, and communities and traditions, they expand us beyond our narrow set of concerns. They make us more truly human than the traditions did that rejected them. I think somewhere Strauss has this nice phrase that the human being transcends himself in two directions, in the direction of the animals and the beasts, and in the direction of the divine or the gods. So it's not possible just to reject, if you reject the realm of the divine, you're left with basically transcendence in the direction of the animals. It's either one or the other somehow. There's no bare humanism. There's no human who's cut off from his depths and his heights. And when we try to do that, if we try to cut off the heights, we just slide into the depths. So maybe that's too brutal of a way of putting it. I don't know, but I think it captures something true about the situation. So the religious, Dugin, he says in the Fourth Political Theory, because of the crisis of modernity, the crisis of liberalism, and the crisis of postmodernity, he says, everything that modernity cast out, suddenly we want to put back on the table for consideration. That's not only organized religion, it's also the mystical tradition, it's also esotericism, it's also these sort of the dark logos, as he puts it, Hermeticism, Gnosticism, various other kinds of teachings. Again, not in order to become slavish servants of them, but in order to see what parts of the comprehensive human experience have we rejected and therefore distorted our current individual and social lives. I agree with you that somehow the spirit of the times is people sensing that we live in a distorted, house of crazy mirrors. And we're trying to understand, right? How did we get in here? Why is who broke the glass? Like, what does it look like when everything's the way that it's supposed to be? And the atheists who consider themselves, by the way, there are intellectually respectable forms of atheism and all that. So this is not, but the atheists who don't know that they've inherited a tradition of anti-traditionalism, they think they're anti-traditional, but they're just carrying a torch of anti-traditionalism that's been passed down from century to century. They could consider that the traditional traditionalism also has something important to say that's not so thoughtless, and that is they're as traditional as the traditionalists, just they've inherited a decapitated or distorted tradition, so that's a part of the picture too. But somehow there are people, maybe like Rupert Sheldrake, like Michael from Ancient Greece Revisited, like yourself and like myself, who think that there's more to being human than we're used to seeing these days. And that there's a kind of expanse or extended humanity that for some reason we've only gotten a narrow slice of under the current circumstances. And I think anybody who helps us to see more of that, to put more of it back, to piece ourselves back together again to a certain extent, is helping human meaningfulness, human happiness, and the prospects of human society. Otherwise, we go the way of greater fragmentation, greater distortion, and that's a possible future. These things may not be fated.
Well, I look at religion now almost like, that hammer metaphor. It's like, you can use a hammer to hit people, or you can use it to build a beautiful house. I kind of, religion, it's the same thing. It's like there's people throughout history who has used it for their own evil. It doesn't necessarily mean the religion is inherently evil, right? And do you want to comment on that?
No, people, yeah, exactly right. People can use atheism and scientism for evil also, right? So exactly. When these things, when we have religion, atheism, and these other ideologies as things that we wield, then of course they can be wielded in many different ways, right? For building or for burning. But we want to, I think, speaking for myself at least, there's a sense in which I would like to explore in my studies, and the authors that I love, they explore this in their studies, moving from the manipulative attitude towards religion and atheism and ideology, where they're tools in our hands, to something that like grasps us instead of us grasping it. Because when we're grasping it, I think in a way this is what Heidegger meant when he talked about the return to Christianity possibly being nihilistic. One of the ways you can think about it. is that whether I'm holding religion in this hand or atheism in this hand, behind the scenes, there's still something unaccounted for doing all the manipulation, right? Versus who you are being exposed to being grasped by the truth, or being grasped by beauty, or being grasped by purpose and destiny and love and all of those things. Where it's no longer in our hands, the sort of relationship there has changed, who's holding whom or who's in charge of what. So I think it's a helpful way to entertain that shift. I'm not saying go be seized or possessed by truth, love, and beauty, but the idea that we move from manipulating it to being under its effect helps, I think, to create some distance, between the possible, because it could seem like as long as I'm using religion to manipulate, or as long as I'm using atheism to manipulate, but it's still manipulation, whichever hand it's on, right? The question is there something else? Is there some other way of relating to the world than that? There better be. I think there is. The authors I love think there is.
And something
right.
you talked about quite a bit was interpretation of things, right? Like you were talking about how you were initially attracted to people who were, I believe your professor was a fan of Leo Strauss, and his interpretation of the old classics were influenced by his Leo Strauss perspective, right? And so that's the other thing we have to take in consideration. If it doesn't matter if it's a religious book, if we take, anything can be sway. Like there's no such thing as a neutral perspective. Everything's influenced by something, and
yeah.
And so counting on, like you were I've heard you before talk about how like reading Plato or reading, whatever it may be, take in consideration who's translating it and how that might affect the way they're interpreting it, right?
Yeah, completely. Let me just say a couple of things. So one is that I think there can be an atheistic religiosity. So it seems religious, it's actually atheistic, and a religious atheism, where it seems atheistic, it's actually deeply religious. So even that, right, can be very misleading. You always have to sort of probe a little bit thoughtfully, right, and see what a person's saying, what they're doing, and whether any of it makes sense. As for the translation of the old books, one of the key things that Strauss showed is let's say I'm translating Plato from Greek into English, and he has one word that he uses throughout the Greek. But in translating it, I use 5 different words and never let the reader know. Why do I use 5 different words? Because sometimes I think this will be the better choice. Sometimes I think that'll be the better choice. I let my judgment get in the way of the possibility that the reader forms his own judgment. That's a very simple example. But now the egregious examples are where there are like complete passages left out of the translation or really serious distortions. If I interpret a word, let's say he says the passage of time, just an example, random example, okay? Imagine in the original it says passage of time, and in my translation I say progress. Well, those are 2 hugely different things, because the passage of time need not be progress. It could be cyclical, it could be regressive, it could be meaningless, chaotic, or random. So Strauss, when he looked back over the existing translations of these books, he saw it's not just that it was a quote unquote bad translation, it made it impossible to understand the author. Like you don't have a hope in heaven of understanding Plato if you rely on a translation that isn't consistent with respect to the key terms, let's say, okay, or that leaves things out, or that reads Enlightenment terminology into a pre-Enlightenment text. The interpretation thing, this is kind of, I just want to share this because I did mention it on, I think it was Thaddeus Russell's show, but this was a key moment for me in my life before academia, before Strauss, before Heidegger, before Dugin, when I was reading these mystics. Some of them were Christian mystics, some were Jewish, some were Islamic, some were whatever else, okay? And all of them had talked about some experience of transcending the ordinary world and having a direct encounter with the divine. That's how they saw it. They're like, I had a direct encounter with the divine, not mediated in most cases by nature. So it's not like they were walking through the forest and they saw a tree and the tree started talking to them or something and they considered that a meeting with the divine. They had an experience as they saw it with the divine, unmediated by the natural world. And they expressed that in the terms from their tradition. So Christian mystics, some of them, said, I'm crucified with Christ, nevertheless I live, yet not I, but Christ lives in me. Or they said they're experiencing the mysterious light of Tabor. This is one of the mystical images from Orthodox Christianity. Or if they were Jewish, they talked about the Shekhinah, or they talked about the Merkaba, or they talked about some figure in Jewish mysticism. And the language in which they expressed their fundamental insight varied as a function of which religion they belonged to, or whether they belonged to one at all. But it seemed to me the experience itself did not vary as a function of the interpretation. So that little notion, I'm not even saying it is that way, but that idea, that thought, it later served and still serves as a tool for me to try to understand, like, okay, Dugin says something in the language of the Russian tradition that's available to him, and this other guy is talking about, the hidden imam from Shia. Is there something linking them beneath the different skins in which they're clothing their original thought or experience? There may be or may not be, but that was a life-changing notion, let's say.
Well, the interpretation thing comes into play even in regards to modern science. That's one thing that, I kept trying to tell people during the lockdowns and all that stuff. I'm like, one expert opinion should not be the one that we all adopt. Prior to that, it was okay for a doctor to have a second opinion, because not just in science, in all things, sometimes somebody can look at the same thing and come up with a different interpretation of what they're seeing. So it was, I could see the similarities in regards to just kind of all of a sudden our understanding that everything's interpretation just went out the window, and it's like we've adopted one interpretation and that's the only one that's true, and that's a huge issue. But yeah, go ahead.
There's this I don't talk a lot about Jewish tradition because I only know little parts of it, some of which I teach in my school, other ones I write about. But there's this one that I like, which is that in one of the Jewish books, okay, that Orthodox Jews and let's say studious Jews study, there's this notion that the rabbis are debating some point of law. They're debating, and then ultimately a decision has to be made. And a decision is made. But the book also says, these and those are the words of the living God. In other words, just because we had to make a decision in favor of one policy or one law doesn't mean that the other side was completely wrong, off base, to update it to the science, like unscientific, racist, genocidal, hates babies, wants to go around killing everybody. No, like interpretations can differ, legitimately differ. There's not the data don't interpret themselves. People who interpret the data, right? And if there was a little bit more sensitivity to, even among the well-trained, highly published scientific community, a little bit more acknowledgement of the fact that, look, yes, we have to make a policy decision. We can't leave all the policy decisions open. We maybe have to favor one interpretation over another one, but without demonizing the people who have good reason to think that the other interpretation has more weight. The tension between keeping an interpretation open, not as an intellectual exercise, but because you're actually just trying to make sense of it, and closing it for policy purposes, those two things also should be kept separate, so that, quote unquote, these and those are the words of the living God. We're both scientists trying to figure this out. I can imagine them saying, right? I'm no dumber than you are. You're no dumber than I am. We have a difference as to the interpretation. Let's roll with the policy that makes sense and continue to observe the evidence and see whether one of the other interpretations might not eventually show that it's more viable. So that very elementary principle of respect and of the understanding that data don't interpret themselves and all of that, for sure was out the window for a long time. And instead it was like, if you don't exactly 100% accept my interpretation of what's going on, you're subhuman, basically. And, you should be locked in the cage and throw the key to the fish. That's too bad. That's not the way anything works. Like, nothing is self-interpreting. The meaning, and even if you knew exactly what the data are, and even if you knew exactly what to expect from them, you still have an interpretation over what's advantageous or not, what's just or not, what's right and wrong, what's long-term benefits, long-term harms. So there's a lot of improvement in the social culture war side of things. I think that still needs to be made for being open, just like you said, and just like we talked about with regard to Dugin, considering the interpretations, even when you have to make a policy decision that might go against them.
Well, we might, I don't know, maybe we do, maybe we don't disagree on their intentions. I don't think they're in many cases, things that we're referring to, their intentions were pure anyways. I don't think it was like, hey, this is just, I am blind to the fact that this other interpretation could be something we should entertain. I don't think it was just ego. I think that it was maybe more dangerous than that. Maybe it was actually it wasn't ego, it was evil. That and I think that's why a lot of spiritual or religious people could see what was going on in the world at that time quicker than everybody else, because I think when you believe in good and evil, you understand evil can and does exist. And throughout history, there's always been people who do evil things, and we don't live in a world with exceptions to that rule. That they could kind of, it was easier for them to digest or come to the realization of what could possibly be, what was possibly going on in the world and what was being done. What they were going to knowingly harm people, and they were okay with it. Now, for what reasons, and that's a debate that I remember even Thaddeus Russell years ago when he was on this show. I shouldn't say debate, because I'm an idiot just exploring ideas, but I pushed back a little bit about how I think their intentions are more than maybe just power and money, but it could be ideology and this idea that they do want to rule the world. And now we just live in this facade that we don't have a monarchy, but we really kind of still do live in a monarchy.
Yeah, that's a part of it. Evil people doing evil things, and I don't deny, and I think you're right when you say that. I don't deny that that's part of the picture, and that's got to be there for us to see the picture. And I think you're right that when you allow yourself to think in terms of spiritual forces, good and evil, angels and demons, that's helpful for some people. You can make sense of some things that you couldn't make sense of otherwise. But just like you said earlier, we don't want to know what to think, we want to know how to think, or we want to teach not just what to think, but how to think. There, even in the language of angels and demons, sometimes you can be mistaken. Angel looks like a demon, demon looks like an angel. I'm not talking in particular about the recent history of COVID and all of that, but I just mean we have to have a little bit of humility there too, to a certain extent, when we're using those categories, to make sure we're using them well. I don't say we have to have them off the table. We just got to make sure we don't swing them like a hammer at every problem that we see. So the more tools we have available, whether it's seeing clearly that something's evil and calling it evil, seeing that it's muddy and trying to clarify it, seeing that there are various legitimate interpretations, trying to sort them out. We should have, I'm a maximalist in this sense. Just like in political theory, I try to be a maximalist. The more and like you said earlier, the more tools you have on the table to work with, the more concepts you have to draw on, the more you can apply, hopefully, the right one under the right circumstances accurately. So if it's evil, you call it evil. If it's muddy, you call it muddy. And to a certain extent, I would say that's the most we can hope for. Like, we want to be able to see things clearly. We want to be able to diagnose them well and not badly, and improve them within our scope, right? All of that's important. The ability to improve it, the ability to judge it, the ability to see it. So
yeah, that's
everybody. That accounts for a lot, right? That accounts for a lot. Simplifying, but it accounts for a lot. Strauss and Heidegger, these guys, to a certain extent, they help us to see. Like, Strauss helps us to see what categories are we using that are not appropriate for the occasion. They're too distorted or they're too limited. Heidegger too. Heidegger talks a lot about basic concepts. Says whenever we think about something, we're using certain basic concepts that don't normally come to the surface of our attention, that are shaping what it is we're thinking about. But those basic concepts, they have their own history, the history of philosophy. And so somehow, like, even if you're thinking about life is a basic concept in some of the sciences. It's a basic concept somehow in our lives. And yet, what we mean by life isn't always something that we clarify for ourselves thematically. And ultimately, for Heidegger, it's being itself is the basic concept that we take for granted in everything that we do, without actually making it a question for ourselves, the meaning of being. These guys, all of them, each in their own way, helps us to think more richly so that we can act and judge more competently. What else could you hope for in a way? I mean, like you said, you're not going to wave a magic wand and get evil out of the world. That's not going to happen. But identifying it, dealing with it, responding to it, same with the good, understanding what's good and how to promote it. Those things are not, if they were inborn, Strauss has this argument. If we had conscience, if we had moral judgment, it's actually an interesting debate. We don't have to go into it, but I'll just raise it here. If we had a sense of justice and injustice, kind of naturally given to us as conscience, it would be difficult to make sense of a couple of things, namely that people disagree fundamentally about justice and injustice, good and bad, and also that it seems like it actually requires some study and some learning to develop the ability to reason about these things well. So do we even have a automatic access to moral judgment? Do we have a faculty like conscience that shows us really easily without much effort? Now, we have revulsion, we have repulsion, and there are cases, obviously, like I said, the teaching 2-year-old kids all kinds of crazy stuff about sex. In my view, that's not up for dispute. Like, you see that and you just know. That's evidence, in my view, for a conscience or for this innate sense of justice. And there's other evidence like it, but how often, how far that goes and whether you can trust it in every case. Politics, when it comes to the big decisions, if it was clear cut, there would never be need for any dispute. Okay, some things are clear cut, some things are complicated. Is a unipolar world better than a multipolar world? Is the state the best form of social organization? You can't have recourse to your internal sense of judgment, justice, right and wrong. Your conscience is not going to answer the question for you. Is the state the best form of social organization? Your conscience might answer the question for you. Should I should I go kill an innocent guy for no reason? Yeah, okay, your conscience will serve you well there. Should we have states or empires? Oh boy, you're going to ask your conscience? No, that requires something more. But it's still a kind of moral question. So there are huge tasks ahead of us. And everybody doing anything, I give all credit where it's due. I only want to say that the history of political philosophy and these figures, they help us. They help us deal with these huge questions that we can't avoid. There's a lot at stake around them. They're not as abstract as they seem. And we need all the help we can get from thoughtful people in thinking through them.
Yeah, without a doubt. I can't stress that enough, to just explore as many different thinkers as possible and as many different perspectives as possible. I always kind of look at it as like I'm in this cave with wisdom and knowledge. And, each thinker I discover is a flashlight. And one flashlight, I'd be like, okay, he's kind of shining light on everything, and it all makes sense. And this is about everything that's in the cave, so I get it. And then you realize, like, oh wait, there's this other thinker, and his flashlight's a black light that exposes other things in the cave that the other flashlight didn't expose. And I'm like, I didn't even know this was here, And so it's it's so important to do that. Most things are not black and white. Just about everything can be debated or can be argued. Even with just recently, I was talking to a friend who was pro a woman's choice for abortion. I'm like, well, there's some states that let you do it like many weeks. Are you okay? He's like, oh wait, I don't think I'm okay with that. I'm like, see, like, even the issues that you're passionate about, there's some wiggle room and there's some debate that people should be having, and we should be exploring all these perspectives. And obviously it's easier to divide and conquer when the TV, media, governments use our tribalistic tendencies to kind of just like get us to join groups and defend our groups. But I think the world is not just more complex, but much more interesting. But I can't thank you enough, Michael, for being with me. I'm a huge fan. You're one of my favorite thinkers out there. And you have just exposed me to so many other really fascinating thinkers. And again, thanks for the time you've taken. And I want people to get an opportunity to keep up with your work, anything you have up and coming, any social media platforms you're on, please let the listeners know where they can connect with you.
All right. Well, thanks for that. I appreciate it and the invitation. It's been a real pleasure. You can follow me on Twitter. It's M_Millerman is my Twitter. That's where I do most of my social media activity. My school, millermanschool.com, has a 30-day free trial with a bunch of lectures on the thinkers that I mentioned. I also sell things, but you don't have to buy them. I have a book on Heidegger. You can get it at heideggerbook.com if anybody wants that. It's on Strauss, Derrida, Dugin, Rorty, and Heidegger. And I have some things coming out that I'm working on now. I want to publish a collection of my essays on Dugin. So I'm working on that just to make them easily accessible, readable in one place, elevate the discussion around him to a certain extent. And I'll have more courses, more books and things like that coming out, everything I usually announce on the Twitter or on my mailing list. But Twitter's my main platform. The school's my main business.
Awesome. Yeah. And please support people like yourself. Many people listen to the show are like me. They either left high school and never went back to any type of school because they had such a bad taste in your mouth. But now a lot of these online kind of things are becoming popular, and people who are looking at education from a different light, which I think is really important. And Dugan, if you're listening, I'll be more than happy to have you on. I've already been kicked off YouTube, so I'm on all the other platforms that will let me share any thought-provoking conversations like this without censorship. So, more than happy to have him on. And people listening, please explore the people that he's referring to, and I think that it really is, it'll be useful to expand your worldview and your thinking and whatnot. So thank you again, Mr. Millerman. Thank you so much for your time, for all your hard work, for everything that you're doing and going against the grain when necessary. And hopefully we talk again in the near future.
I look forward to it.
Thanks. Take care.